This is The Reality Check, presented by the SAP News Network. Here's your host, John Lieberman.
Welcome to Reality Check. I'm John Lieberman. So good to have you all here. This is a show about bringing together top minds from all over the world to discuss the hot button issues of the day. I can't tell you how excited I am with the group we've assembled today to tackle this issue of climate change. Let's bring them in now. Dr. Celine Hawaya, she's the PwC Global Climate Change Leader, joining us from London. Good to see you, Doctor.
Hi, nice to see you.
Dr. Richard Munang, joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. He is the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the UN Environment Program. It's so great to see you, Doctor. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, John.
And our friend Mike Berry, Strategic Advisor and the Director at Mike Berry Co., a sustainable business consulting company. Mike, it's nice to see you.
And you, John, and thanks for reminding me that I never wrote my PhD up to be a doctor with the other two.
You are a doctor, right?
Could have been, should have been, but wasn't.
We often see headlines about climate change, and we often, see these warnings from groups like the Red Cross. Listen, the world should react with the same urgency to climate change as it is to the coronavirus crisis. Global warming poses an even greater threat than COVID. Celine, starting with you, your reaction.
Both are systemic shocks, right? We knew a pandemic would be coming at some point. We absolutely know climate change is around the corner. It is absolutely fundamental. I mean, what we have to do to solve for climate change, unfortunately, is much more complex and just as urgent. We have to kind of halve global emissions in the next 10 years, which means radically transforming every sector of our global economy in the next 10 years, 2 business cycles. So yeah, very complex and very urgent.
Richard, your thoughts on the Red Cross comment?
Actually, the changing climate is no longer an abstract issue. It's moved a long-distance issue into the present. And in October 2020, the United in Science report unequivocally pointed to the fact that climate change has not stopped for COVID-19. And it then means if nothing is done, then definitely the world is going to move towards an apocalypse.
Mike, let me bring you in. Let me ask you this. We often see these warnings from groups like the Red Cross, but I don't know globally that we see the kind of outrage or push that something needs to be done now in quite the way that we do about other issues. Why don't we see it more?
Because it's always been about something that's going to happen in the future, 5, 10, 15 years from now. It's somebody else's problem. I think what we've seen in the last 12 months is this devastating impact of wild weather events around the world. From the Arctic, California, Brazil, wildfires, devastating hurricanes in the Atlantic, flooding across the southern US, across Europe, right away across the Indian subcontinent. I mean, here in the UK, we had the wettest ever February and the driest ever May in the space of 3 months. So suddenly this is becoming real to people. And when you look at customer research or citizen research around the world about their feelings about climate change, it's utterly driven by their experience of it. And as more and more people are experiencing it, they're getting worried, they're getting angry, they're demanding change.
How does this issue of climate change and sustainability and all of this, how does it become more than just a buzzword for companies who must lead the way across the world?
Well, let me give you three practical examples. I mean, first from the British retail sector. In the middle of the pandemic, with a devastating impact on retail, 63 British retailers have come together and said, we have to get to net zero for scope 1 and 2, their own operations, lorries, shops, offices, and scope 3, these vast global supply chains and consumer use of the billions of products they sell by 2040, 10 years ahead of what any government wants. So retailers are stepping forward, but they're doing it together because no one can tackle this on their own. The systemic issues they face in terms of heavy goods vehicles, deforestation, food waste cannot be solved together. The second example is NatWest, the bank, who've said that they're going to disclose their scope 3 carbon emissions. Again, that's the carbon emissions from who they loan to and who they fund. Not only that are they going to disclose them, but they're going to halve them over the next 10 years. So again, financial institutions doing it. And my final example is Unilever, who surprisingly uses 1 million tons of oil every year in billions of home care products it sells around the world. That oil has to come out to be replaced by alternatives, low carbon alternatives. That's €1 billion R&D mission that they're on to deliver that by 2030. So wherever we look, big business is making big commitments for change.
So how can technology and innovation push us forward here, Celine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think Mike gave some great examples in terms of how big companies are committing to change, right? It's actually, I think today it's something like 320 big global companies are committed to net zero. And just under half of total global assets under management, the investors there are committing to decarbonize their portfolios. So stuff is happening. But what happens when these companies commit to net zero? Well, probably the first kind of 5-10 years of that decarbonization journey is possible with stuff that we have available at the moment, right? But actually some of the more difficult, challenging things, if you're in the concrete and building sector, there's an absolute core focus around how you think about new materials for concrete, recycled concrete that can even pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you're in the energy sector, right, a lot of the innovation has to happen in energy around moving to the 3Ds grid, so away from a centralized grid towards a decentralized, digitized, and decarbonized grid. And to do that, I mean, the good news is we're in the middle of the fastest period of innovation ever, the fourth industrial revolution, AI, machine learning, blockchain, quantum, advanced computing, cloud, advanced materials, biosynthetics, and this full suite of technologies is actually coming together to help solve some of these harder challenges.
Richard, I want to bring you back in. I have two questions for you. The first one being, what can we learn from what you've been able to spearhead in Africa? What can the rest of the world learn from what's being done in that part of the world?
Yeah, I think John, Mike, and Selena put it very excellently. The reality is this: if you look at climate change, the fact that it's been considered a distant issue have made people sometimes disenfranchised. I'm not really worried about what to do. But actually, climate change is a disguised opportunity, because if you look at the opportunities that are hidden under the changing climate, especially across the entire African continent, we have a continent that is losing food worth $48 billion US. So if I start from the food agro value chain, 48 billion being lost, the only way to reverse those post-harvest losses is to tap into clean technologies. And what the young people are doing, they are being guided to develop solar dryers from local material that is actually 200% cheaper than imported solutions. And that is helping mothers in villages dry their vegetables, dry their tomatoes, dry their food crops, and this is putting more money in their pockets. The second aspect that we are seeing is that if you look at a continent that have 620 million citizens energy impoverished, leveraging from the 365 days of sunshine, people can then be able to get access to electricity in villages, tapping into solar energy that can then be able to go down to areas that have never ever seen electricity in their life. But that is not enough. Also tapping into that to be able to add value to what is produced, create more income streams, create more opportunities, and also jobs for the youth. And the third aspect that we are saying is that if you look at climate action as an investment opportunity, not just as a silo environmental obligation, it then demystifies the narrative that climate change is actually just for those who are environmentally driven, or it's something for the environment ministry rather than something for everyone. So the demystification of the narrative from climate change being a social issue or just a silo issue to a business investment opportunity, building on the practical examples that I've given of developing solar dryers, of turning waste to briquettes, or turning waste to fertilizers, gives a different dimension that people can actually create businesses leveraging on climate action solutions. And that narrative have not actually become part of the mainstream. And that needs to actually become part of the mainstream as we speak.
And Richard, in a second, I want to dig even deeper on that, the idea of sustainability and profitability. But something that you said really got in my brain, and that is, what I'm hearing you say is that some of the best innovation is coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the communities. It's coming from the young people. It's not necessarily all starting from the top down and these big companies that are pushing things down, but it's more of this bottoms up approach there in Africa. Is that a correct assessment?
Absolutely, very correct. And this stems from the fact that the challenges have not actually been met for quite a very long time to be seen as disguised opportunities, as I said earlier. And when you look at what the young people are doing, they are very creative, they are very entrepreneurial, and at the same time, they're energetic. And what they have been missing is just guidance in a way that drives them towards leveraging climate action solutions. Climate change is a business opportunity for you to solve a community problem and at the same time put more money in your pockets. And they have been tapping into that. And as a result of that, one aspect that has been coming out very clear is that when people know that they are going to benefit from an action, they embrace it.
Fascinating. It's an issue of survival. I mean, it's fascinating. Celine and Mike, I want to bring you back in and kind of switch gears a little bit, back to this idea of sustainability and profitability. How do sustainability and profitability coexist?
I'll give you two quick examples. The first is building on the point we just had from Richard about entrepreneurs. We did a piece of work looking actually at the startup ecosystem for startups trying to solve for climate. So not just the traditional look at clean tech and energy, but much more broadly built environment, ag tech, heavy manufacturing, etc. And we actually saw when we looked at the last 8 years of startup data, investing into those startups globally, we've seen a rate of, it's 86 per year compound annual growth rate, right? So just to put that into context for the whole of the VC industry as a whole, that's 5 times the average rate of growth and 3 times the rate of growth we see in the AI sector at a time when investment into AI startups massively uptick. So there is a real value creation, a value opportunity there that's starting to be realized for entrepreneurs who are creating very commercially scalable businesses that are also helping to solve for climate. And we see the first generation of climate tech unicorns. On the other side, just quickly as a second point, more broadly, value creation and climate change. I mean, and this is something we now build in when we do work on deals advisories for mergers and acquisitions, right? When we support companies and thinking really in that kind of hard nuts way around how you create value. And the simple point is for a lot of companies with the liabilities coming in from the change of legislation, you actually have a balance sheet impact on your balance sheet if you assume a carbon price of $100 per ton by the end of this decade, that's really going to hit home hard on higher emitting companies because of those regulatory changes. And on the positive side, you have a real value creation opportunity for putting out new products and services in the market that help on the transformation. So businesses are really actually now starting to think about it. It's a boardroom issue. It's an issue for the CFO. It's an issue for the chief strategy officer, not the CSR department anymore.
So Mike, I've heard great examples. How do we get more businesses to take notice? Because I feel like we're getting good examples, but we need more quantity. Your thoughts?
Well, John, I mean, the old paradigm was a few very public brands have wanted to avoid a fallout with The Guardian or with Greenpeace and therefore did something voluntarily. They could also extract some cost savings from cutting energy use, for example, fuel use, great. That was version 1.0. Version 2.0, that is basic survival. If you're cut off from capital because your investors now expect it of you, if national governments around the world are legally decarbonising their economy and you're not keeping up, you'll be out of business. But most importantly of all, the products and services you sell have to have low carbon at the heart of them. 10 years ago, the coal industry sat there smugly and looked at wind and solar and thought it'll never take off. It's expensive, it's intermittent. Now it's being destroyed. The car industry 3 years ago was sat there complacent, laughing at Tesla. Now it's being destroyed. The same with the meat industry, complacent looking at plant-based and laboratory-grown alternatives. The same with the fast fashion industry, thinking it's still about buy it once, wear it once and throw it away. It's now about resale platforms. So every sector in the world is being systemically disrupted by sustainability in general, low carbon in particular. If you're not embracing it as part of your business model that you offer to your customers in the future, you're gone.
Celine, what keeps you up at night in terms of climate change and, worst case scenarios?
Well, what keeps me happy before I go to bed is the action we're starting to see out in the real economy. What keeps me up actually is the doctor bit is that I'm actually a climate scientist. I did a NASA fellowship before I joined PwC, or many years before I came into the private sector. And the science keeps me up, and specifically the science of the positive feedback loops in the system. We know a lot about the physical feedback loops, so things like sea ice, albedo, clouds, things like that, and the positive feedback they have. We know very little in terms of biophysical feedback loops. So the 10 years that we have, that scientists think we have until we reach this threshold of 1.5 degrees of potentially dangerous global warming, if you exceed that, right, it might not actually be 10 years. That might actually be liberal, right? Because there are biophysical feedback loops, including, Amazon getting to the point of no return in terms of loss of the Amazon rainforest, and then potential dieback in terms of warmer temperatures, slowing down the carbon dioxide removal potential of plants and phytoplankton, in terms of big methane clathrates underneath the permafrost in the Arctic. So we don't actually know about all of that in a lot of detail yet. And the 10 years we think we have before 1.5 might actually be less.
Mike, how do we get this message to everyday people across the world? Maybe people in between the ones Richard described about the bottom-up approach and almost needing to innovate to survive, between there and kind of the richest companies in the world. How do we reach that whole middle segment of the world?
So, John, GlobeScan just done a survey of 27,000 citizens across the planet asking if they care about climate change. The great news is 90% said this is important. When they were asked, but should we act on COVID first or climate first? In the developing world that's suffering the most, just look what's happening in Central America with the latest superpowered hurricane hitting it. People said, absolutely, it's about climate change. I'm suffering today. In the rich Western world, a little bit more complacency. It's climate change. I sort of see it a little bit. As California burns, southern US floods, as we try and get food from the UK food system against drought and flood at the same time, people here start to think, wow, climate change, we need to act. So that's the first point. The second point is the solutions we offer to them have to be better than the previous solution for them as well as planet.
So many lessons learned here. As we wrap up, I just want to go around and ask you each, what did we miss in this conversation? What else do we need to touch on? Richard?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the aspect of making climate action as an investment opportunity, using the lessons that have already been learned, and actually driving the case that good climate policy is good economic policy, as Mike have said, is very, very crucial, because the reality, as I said earlier, is climate change or climate action has been made as a silo environment discourse sometimes, and that become part of the mainstream. I think, just lastly, building on what Celine has also said, is if you look at what keeps people awake at night, generally across the continent today, is to put food on the table, is to send their kids to school. It's about economics, it's about socio-economic opportunities. And if any solution that doesn't take, if solutions don't take that dimension, we might be in this for quite a very long haul in convincing people about taking climate action.
So Celine, on what Richard just said, how much of this is about messaging and maybe getting away from, some of the vernacular of global climate change and making it just more relevant to people's everyday lives? How much of it is about that, Celine?
I think for consumers and for voters, absolutely. And they're clearly two hugely powerful levers. I think business leaders is a different question. And then it becomes back to, okay, how is it really relevant to the bottom line, right? And that's clearly the focus there. And I think in terms of the bottom line, the more that we get regulatory changes coming in that kind of support that, the more that helps to push, structural changes in the economy, that helps to push things in the right direction. And I think when we've had those changes come in recently, that's where we've seen an uptick of investors going, okay, I can see how this now impacts my balance sheet if we have a carbon, tax of this coming in. So I think we haven't touched on governments too much, but governments have a critical role to play in structurally changing some of the incentives that are there right now to level the playing field with clean, newer technologies that are coming in. Because those are fundamental. We still have a huge amount of fossil fuel subsidies. We still have not right investment into the infrastructure needed for EVs, into even thinking about hydrogen and needing to replace all of our gas boilers we have with hydrogen boilers in the coming years. So the role of governments will be absolutely key as well.
In your opinion, Mike, I'm going to give you the final word. How important is a global approach, and what Celine sort of mentioned, the idea that government, public sector needs to be more involved too?
We need both. So COP26 in Glasgow in a few months' time has to be a success. Global governments have to step forward collectively and say net zero is what we're going to drive across our entire economies. That's top down. I love what Richard said about the grassroots movement though. We need cities, we need communities empowered and unleashed to come up with the solutions that work specifically for them. Not just countries are different from each other, but regions within countries are different. And that takes me back to the final point. Celine was a brilliant advocate of this. Technology, the fourth industrial revolution, empowers the grassroots to make a change and gives people the tools that we need to develop a low carbon future. I've got grey hair in my head because I'm an old man, but also because I try to track and trace 3 billion items that Marks and Spencer sold every year from thousands of factories, tens of thousands of farms, thousands of raw material sources. I tried to do it with a spreadsheet, a pen and a paper. It was bonkers. It was impossible. With AI, with big data, I can suddenly get a grasp of these trillions of items that flow across the planet and make them low carbon.
Celine, Richard, Mike, what an amazing conversation on global climate change. Thank you all so much. And I want to have you all back a year from now to revisit many of these issues and hopefully to discuss a lot of the progress that has been made in these areas. But an absolutely terrific conversation. Thank you so much. And that is it for this episode of Reality Check. I'm John Lieberman. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.